I stood on the porch of my grandmother's house in the October cold, and I punched in the same 4 digits I had been using for 11 years, and the little keypad just blinked red at me once and then again. And I tried a third time slower, this time the way you do when you are telling yourself with increasing desperation that it must be your own mistake, that your fingers must have slipped, that you must have hit a wrong button without realizing it, because the alternative is something you do not want to sit with. The October cold in a black dress, with cemetery grass still clinging to the edges of your heels. I stood there with my finger hovering over the keypad, and I could feel the cold coming up through the floorboards of the porch, through the thin soles of the shoes I had not stopped to change, because my stepmother had called the family back to the house immediately after the burial, practically before the last car had left the cemetery loop. And I had thought I was still family. I had actually thought that I was still part of the group of people who got to walk through that door without knocking, and I had not yet understood. That I was wrong about, that I had not yet understood, that I had been wrong about it for a long time. The porch swing moved slightly in a breeze I could not feel, and the wide front windows were lit from inside, and I could see movement through the glass, someone walking past the living room doorway. And I knew that house better than almost anyone alive. I knew which floorboard creaked in the hallway, and which cabinet door in the kitchen didn't close all the way, unless you lifted it slightly at the hinge. And I knew that my grandmother had pruned the hydrangea bushes along the foundation herself every spring, because she said she didn't trust anyone else to do it right, and she had shown me exactly how to do it when I was 14, where to cut how far back, why you don't take too much at once. And I had not understood at the time that I was learning something I would need to know later. I had not understood that most of the important lessons she gave me were like that, quiet and practical, and not revealing their real purpose, until years had passed, and the moment arrived, and you found yourself standing on a porch in the cold, with a changed code and a closed door, and the understanding that the woman who raised you was gone, and the people who remained had decided without telling you that you were no longer welcome in the only home that had ever felt like home. I rang the doorbell, and I heard it inside the house, that particular 2-note chime that had sounded the same way since I was 9 years old, and I waited, and the door opened, and my stepmother was standing there already out of her funeral clothes, and into a cardigan and slacks, and she had a glass of red wine in her hand. And she looked at me the way you look at a delivery person whose package you weren't expecting, not hostile exactly, but not quite seeing me as someone who belonged there either. And she said, "We are just settling, and it has been an exhausting day." And I waited for her to open the door wider, and she didn't, and I said, "I just want to get a few of my things. I keep some of my books in the back room." And Grandma had a photo album she promised me, and my stepmother looked at me with an expression that I had seen before in smaller moments over the years, but had never let myself fully name. And she said, "We will go through everything together as a family once things are sorted." And then she closed the door, and I stood there on the porch with the light on above me and the cold rising through the boards. And I understood something that I had been trying not to understand for 3 hours, and probably longer, and that, if I am being honest with myself, I understood that I was not part of the we she was referring to, and I had not been for a long time, and everyone had simply been too polite or too careful or too something to make it this plain before. If you have ever been in a moment where you realized that something you believed about your own life was wrong, not in a small way, but in a structural way, the way a foundation is wrong, not the paint color, not the curtain choice, but the thing underneath that holds everything else up, then you know that there is a particular quality to the silence that follows that realization. And I stood in that silence on that porch, and I felt it move through me like something physical, not like sadness exactly, and not like anger either, but more like the feeling of a load-bearing wall giving way inside your chest quietly, and without the dramatic crash you might expect, just a slow internal collapse that you can hear if you're quiet enough. And I was quiet enough, standing there in my black dress with my heels sinking slightly into the porch boards, and the hydrangea stumps bare along the foundation, and the light above me clicking on automatically, because the sensor was still set to the same schedule my grandmother had programmed years ago, and none of them had bothered to change that, at least not yet. And I thought about how she would have noticed that detail, how she would have said something about the timing of the sensor and the angle of the light, and whether it was reaching the walkway properly. And I thought about how many small things like that were already being overlooked inside that house by people who had not lived there long enough to know them. And I walked back to my car, and I sat in the driveway for a while with the engine off, and the heat not running, and the cold slowly seeping through the windows, and I thought about the last time I had sat in this driveway like this, which was 2 years ago, when I had moved out of the guest cottage behind the garden and into my one-bedroom apartment in town. And at the time I had told myself, I was being mature, I was getting space, I was not starting conflict. And I had believed that, or I had tried to believe it, because the alternative was admitting that my stepmother's comments about how unusual it seemed for a grown woman to live on. Her grandmother's property had actually driven me out of my own home, and I had let them, and I had not fought, and I had not even named what was happening, and now sitting here again 2 years later with a changed code. And a closed door, I understood that every single moment I had explained away had been a step in a direction I had not wanted to go, and I had taken every one of those steps while telling myself I was choosing something else. I called my father from the driveway, and the phone rang 4 times and went to voicemail, and I sat there looking at the screen, and I sent a text, and he replied 20 minutes later with, "It has been a hard day, let us connect later in the week." And I read that message 3 times, and each time I read it, I understood something more about what it meant, and what it didn't mean, and what it was carefully constructed to avoid saying, and I put the phone down, and I drove to my apartment, which was a 1-bedroom in a building on the edge of town, with a shared laundry room and a parking lot that was always slightly too full, and I walked inside still in my funeral dress. And I did not turn on the lights, and I sat on my couch in the dark, and I thought about my grandmother, and I thought about the fact that she had raised me, and what that actually meant when you stripped away all the polite language people use to avoid saying what is true. My grandmother raised me in the way that matters, and I need to explain what I mean by that, because it is not a simple thing to say, and it is even less simple to live through. Not legally, my parents were alive, and technically present, my mother lived 45 minutes away, and my father lived an hour away after the divorce, and they were both still in my life, in the sense that they showed up at certain intervals, and said certain things, and performed certain functions that parents are supposed to perform. But my grandmother was the one who was actually there in the daily, unglamorous, unphotographable way that raising a child actually requires. She was the one at the kitchen table with the chemistry textbook when the sun was going down over the lake, and I was 15 and failing to understand molecular bonds. And she did not do it with patience in the way people mean when they say someone was patient. She did it with precision. She would look at the problem, and then look at me, and say, "You are not reading the question carefully, you are reading the words you think are there instead of the words that are actually there." And she would be right every single time, and I would go back and read it again and find that she was right, and slowly over the course of many evenings like that I learned not just chemistry, I learned to read carefully. I learned to stop assuming. I already knew what was in front of me. And that lesson turned out to be the most important thing she ever taught me, though I did not know that at the time. And she would not have told me if I had asked, because that was not her way. She did not announce her lessons. She simply delivered them, and trusted that I would understand later, and I did understand. Later, I understood it standing on a porch in October with a changed code, and I understood it because she had spent years making sure I would. She was a cardiologist for 34 years, the kind of doctor who had a reputation that stretched 2 counties, not because she was warm in the way people want doctors to be warm, but because she was precise in the way that actually saves lives, and patients drove past 3 closer hospitals to see her, because they had heard from someone they trusted that Dorothy Caldwell did not miss things, and she did not cut corners, and she did not tell you what you wanted to hear if what you needed to hear was something harder, and she applied those same standards to everything she did, including raising me. And when I say she raised me, I mean that by the time I was in high school, I was spending most of my time at her house on Lake Caldwell, and she was the person I called when something went wrong, and she was the person who showed up at my school events, and she was the person who sat across from me at the kitchen table and helped me understand not just chemistry, but how to think and how to be honest with myself, and how to pay attention to what people actually did rather than what they said they were doing. And she had a saying she came back to often: the most honest thing about a person is what they do when they think no one important is watching. And I heard her say it to patients, and I heard her say it to medical students she mentored, and I heard her say it to me when I had made some small ethical shortcut as a teenager and thought I had gotten away with it. And she always knew, she always noticed, she noticed everything. She was the kind of person who could walk into a room and within 30 seconds understand the dynamics between the people in it, not because she was intuitive in a mystical way, but because she paid attention in a way that most people do not, and she had been paying attention to my family for decades, and I was about to find out exactly what she had noticed. My father married my stepmother when I was 16, and at first it seemed fine. It seemed like the kind of thing that was not really about me, and I told myself that because that was easier than looking closely at what was actually happening. Her name was Linda, and she had a son from her first marriage named Trevor, who was 2 years younger than me, and my father legally adopted Trevor within 2 years of the marriage. And I remember the day he told me about the adoption. He said it in a very casual way in the car on the way to my grandmother's house, as if it were a minor administrative detail. And I said okay, and I did not say anything else, because I did not know what to say, and I was 16, and I was not good at knowing what to say about things that felt wrong but that I could not yet explain or name. And my grandmother was on the porch when we arrived, and she looked at my father and she looked at me, and she said very little. And later that evening, after my father had left, she sat with me at the kitchen table, and she said sometimes people make decisions that tell you more about them than they realize. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, I mean pay attention. And I did not fully understand what she meant then, but I started paying attention, and once I started, I could not stop. And what I saw was not dramatic. It was not the kind of thing that makes for a clear story with obvious villains. It was slower and quieter than that. It was my stepmother referring to the lake house as the family home in a way that seemed to include her. And it was Trevor starting to call himself my grandmother's grandson. And it was my father not correcting either of those things. And it was small comments my stepmother would make about how much time I spent at house and how it might be healthy for me to develop more independence, and how she thought it was important for families to share space equally. And none of these things were said in a way that you could point to and say, that is cruel, that is wrong, that is the moment everything changed, because they were all said in a tone of reasonableness and concern. And that was the thing about my stepmother that made her so effective at what she did. She never said anything that sounded hostile. She never raised her voice. She never made a scene. She simply advanced her position one reasonable comment at a time, and each individual comment was small enough that responding to it would have made me look sensitive or difficult or dramatic. And she knew that, and I knew that, and so I said nothing and I watched it happen, and I told myself I was choosing peace when what I was actually choosing was silence. And my grandmother watched it too, and she said less than I expected her to say, and I did not understand why at the time, but I understand now. She had been a cardiologist. She understood blockages. She understood how something could be slowly closed off over years without the person experiencing it realizing what was happening until the damage was already done. And she watched it happen in her family the same way she watched it happen in her patients. She watched, and she noted, and she made her decisions, and she did not announce them because that was not her way. She simply acted, and the actions revealed everything. When I was 25, she mentioned to me once in a very casual way that she had put her affairs in careful order, and she said, everything is arranged, you don't have to worry, and I said okay. And I did not ask what she meant exactly, because I trusted her the way she had taught me to trust things, thoroughly based on evidence accumulated over years. And the evidence I had about my grandmother was that she was one of the most careful and precise people I had ever known. And if she said everything was arranged, then everything was arranged, and I did not need to ask for details, because asking for details would have implied that I didn't trust her to handle it, and I trusted her completely, and I was right to trust her, and I was right not to push because she had been planning something that I would not understand for another 4 years, and she had planned it with the same precision she brought to everything else in her life. I moved out of the guest cottage 2 years ago, and I told myself it was my decision. And it was my decision in the sense that no one physically forced me to leave. But it was a decision made under a particular kind of pressure, the kind that is applied so steadily and so reasonably that by the time you act on it, you have almost convinced yourself. It was your idea, and my stepmother had been applying that pressure for months in the form of comments about how it seemed unusual for a grown woman to live on her grandmother's property, and how she thought it might be good for me to have my own space, and how she worried that I was not developing the independence I would need. And she said all of this with a concerned expression and a gentle tone. And my father said nothing, and my grandmother said nothing, or rather my grandmother said one thing, which was that I should do what I thought was right. And at the time I heard that as neutrality. I heard it as her not wanting to take sides, but I think now that she heard it as Something else entirely. I think she was telling me that she trusted me to make the right decision, even if the right decision looked like walking away temporarily. And I think she knew that I would come back, and I think she had already made sure that I would be able to. She was 79 when she died, and her heart, which she had spent a career protecting in other people, gave out on a Tuesday morning in September quickly, and without much warning, and I was at work at the hospital when I got the call, and I remember the way the hallway looked when I put the phone down, the fluorescent lights, and the polished floor, and the sound of a cart going past somewhere behind me, and I remember thinking that it was strange that the world was still organized exactly the same way as it had been 5 minutes ago when my grandmother was alive, because nothing should have been the same and everything should have stopped. And of course it didn't stop, because the world does not stop. And I drove to the house, and I sat with her for a while before the arrangements people came. And I told her things I hope she could still hear, and I told her that I loved her, and that I would try to be the kind of person she thought I was. And I sat there in the quiet of that house that I knew every corner of and I thought about. All the evenings at the kitchen table, and all the mornings on the dock, and all the drives to college visits, and the time she looked at me when I got into nursing school, and said, "I knew you would get in now, the real work starts," and smiled in that small way. She had the one that meant she was genuinely proud, but considered it undignified to make too much of a fuss about it. And I sat there, and I missed her with a missing that felt like a structural failure, like something inside me that she had built had stopped holding its shape. The funeral was 2 weeks later, and my father flew in from Scottsdale, where he now lived with my stepmother and her son, and he looked older than I expected. And he stood at the graveside with his arm around my stepmother, and his face arranged into an expression of appropriate grief. And I noticed not for the first time that he and I had almost nothing to say to each other anymore, and I noticed that my stepmother stood very close to him, and that Trevor stood on his other side, and that the three of them formed a kind of unit, a visual block, that did not include me, and I stood slightly apart from them. And I thought about how my grandmother would have read that spatial arrangement, and what she would have said about it. And I thought she would have said nothing because she would have already known, and she would have already acted. And after the cemetery, my stepmother said that the family would gather at the house. And I thought she meant all of us, and I drove there directly, because I wanted to be in that house again. I wanted to sit in the kitchen and feel the memory of her there, and I wanted to be somewhere that still held the shape of her presence, and I punched in the code, and the code didn't work. And you already know what happened next, you know, about the red blink and the door and the wine and the closed door and the cold porch. And I don't need to tell you again what that felt like, because I have already told you. And some things do not get better or clearer with repetition, they just get heavier. I went to bed that night without eating, and I lay in the dark, and I thought about my grandmother at the kitchen table with the chemistry textbook. And I missed her so much that the missing felt like a physical location, like a room I had walked into and couldn't find the door out of. And I thought about the fact that I had been turned away from the only home that had ever felt like home. And I thought about the fact that my father had sent me a text message that said, "Let us connect later in the week," as if what had happened was a scheduling problem and not a rejection. And I thought about the fact that my stepmother had been out of her funeral clothes and into a cardigan with a glass of wine in her hand, within what could not have been more than an hour and a half since leaving the cemetery. And I thought about what that timing meant, about how quickly she had been waiting to do this thing she had done. And I thought about all the years of small comments and reasonable suggestions and concerned expressions, and I understood that none of it had been small and none of it had been spontaneous. And I understood that my stepmother had been working toward this moment for years, and that my father had let her. And I lay in the dark in my one-bedroom apartment in my funeral dress that I hadn't bothered to take off. And I felt something break inside me, not dramatically, not loudly, just a quiet internal fracture like the kind my grandmother would have recognized in a heart valve, a small failure that would compound over time if left unaddressed. And I did not sleep, and I did not cry, and I just lay there, and I breathed, and I waited for morning, because that was what she would have told me to do, not because she would have said it out loud, but because I had watched her face difficult mornings for 30 years. And I knew what she would have done. She would have gotten up, and she would have made coffee, and she would have done the next right thing, and so that is what I did. The call came on a Thursday morning 11 days after the funeral, and I was at work between patients when my phone showed a number I didn't recognize with a local area code, and I almost let it go to voicemail, because I was tired, and I was behind, and I was still not eating properly, and I was functioning, but only in the way that a person functions when something essential inside them has been damaged but not destroyed. And something made me step into the hallway and answer, and a man's voice said, "Is this Claire Whitfield?" And I said it is, and he said, "My name is Gerald Oates. I am an attorney with Oates and Pellman, and I handled your grandmother's estate planning for the last 14 years. And there was a pause, and he said, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer." And he said, "Are your father and stepmother aware of the Caldwell family trust?" And I didn't say anything for a moment, and I said, "I don't know what that is." And there was another pause, longer this time, and when he spoke again, there was something careful in his voice, the way a person sounds when they are choosing to move slowly, because they know the next thing they say is going to change something. And he said then, "I think we need to meet." His office was on the second floor of a building downtown, the kind of office that had been a law office for a long time, and looked it with oak bookshelves and framed certificates, and a window that looked out onto the main street. And he was in his 60s, trim with reading glasses he kept taking off and holding in one hand while he talked, and he sat behind his desk. And I sat across from him, and he slid a document across the desk to me, and it was a trust agreement, 31 pages, and at the top header it said, "The Caldwell Family Trust, established the 14th of September 2000, and 9 Dorothy Ann Caldwell, grantor," and her handwriting was on the signature page at the back, firm and clear even in a document that old, and he explained it to me slowly and carefully. And I listened, and I understood, because she had taught me to understand things that were explained slowly and carefully. And he said a revocable living trust is different from a will, and he explained how a will goes through probate and becomes a public document administered by the court, subject to a process that can take months, and that everyone named in it typically knows about. And he explained how a trust operates differently, how it transfers outside of probate, how the grantor names a trustee and one or more beneficiaries. And when the grantor dies, those assets move to the beneficiaries quietly through the trust document without a court process. And he said my grandmother had been very deliberate about the timing and method of disclosure, and she had, in his words, anticipated certain dynamics and had structured things accordingly. And I looked at the beneficiary page, and my name was there, my full legal name, Claire Ann Whitfield, primary beneficiary of the Caldwell Family Trust, which included the lake house and the 4 acres, and the building in town where her practice had operated for 3 decades. And I put the document down on the desk, and I looked at Gerald Oates, and I said, "What about the will?" And he nodded like he had expected that question, and he said the will was real, it had been filed, and my father had a copy of it, and the will transferred personal property and accounts and some smaller assets to my father as her surviving child. And that was what my father and stepmother had seen, and that was what they had acted on. And the will made no mention of the trust, because the trust was a separate legal instrument, and the property they were currently occupying and treating as their inheritance, my grandmother's house, was not covered by the will. It was covered by the trust, and the trust belonged to me. And I sat there, and I felt something move through me that I am still not sure I have the right word for. It was not triumph, and it was not relief exactly. It was more like the feeling of a door opening in a room where you had been standing in the dark for 11 days, and light coming through, and the light not being warm or gentle, but being clear. And I said, did my grandmother know they would do this? And I wasn't sure I was asking him exactly. I might have been asking her. And Gerald Oates took his glasses off and held them by one arm for a moment. And he said, "Your grandmother was a very precise woman. I practiced law for 38 years before I started winding down, and she was one of the most precise clients I ever had. She didn't build things this way by accident." I drove home, and I sat in my car in the parking lot of my apartment building for a long time, and I thought about what it would feel like to call my father and tell him, and to watch, even just through a phone call, the moment when the certainty drained out of him. And I thought about how easy it would be to call the attorney back and say, "Proceed immediately," and to let the legal process do its work, and to show up with a sheriff and a certified letter and watch my stepmother's face. And I thought about how good that would feel for about 48 hours. And then I thought about my grandmother saying the most honest thing about a person is what they do when they think no one important is watching. And I thought about the fact that she was watching not because she was the kind of person who believed in that sort of thing literally, but because the habits she had built in me were the most alive part of her that was left, and she had spent 30 years building those habits, and she had done it quietly and consistently in kitchen table Conversations and long drives and small corrections that never felt small at the time. And she had known what I would inherit in every sense of the word. And she had known what she was leaving behind. And she had trusted me to handle it the way she would have handled it. And I sat in that parking lot. And I made a decision. And it was not the easy decision. And it was not the satisfying decision in the short term. But it was the decision that would have made her look at me steadily and smile in that small way. And so I picked up my phone and I called my father, and he answered this time. And I said we need to meet. And I said I want to do it in person. And I said you and Linda should both be there. And there was a silence on the other end. And then he said okay, and we agreed on a coffee shop 2 days later. And I hung up, and I sat in the parking lot for a while longer. And I thought about the fact that I was about to do something that required more from me than anger required. And I thought about the fact that my grandmother had known that, and she had trusted me anyway. But before I get to the coffee shop, I need to tell you what happened the night before because it matters, and it is part of the story, and I have not told you yet. The night before the meeting, I was at my apartment, and I was going over the trust document again, making sure I understood every part of it, because that is what she would have done. And I was sitting on my couch with the pages spread out on the cushion next to me. And I started to feel something that I recognized because I am a nurse, and I have been around enough medical situations to know the signs, and what I felt was a kind of dizziness. That was not quite dizziness, it was more like the room was very slowly tilting, and I put the document down, and I put my head between my knees, and I told myself. It was because I hadn't been eating, and I told myself. It was because I hadn't been sleeping, and I told myself it was stress. And then I passed out, and I don't mean I fell asleep, I mean I lost consciousness. And when I came to, I was on the floor and my shoulder hit the edge of the coffee table on the way down, and I could feel a sharp pain there, and I could feel my heartbeat in my ears, and I lay on the floor of my apartment and I looked at the ceiling, and I thought about the fact that my grandmother had died of a cardiac event, and I thought about the fact that I was 28 and healthy, and that this was almost certainly a vasovagal response from dehydration and stress, and not a cardiac event. And I thought about how she would have assessed the situation calmly and systematically. And I did that. I assessed it calmly and systematically. And I determined that I was not in immediate danger. And then I thought about whether I should go to the hospital. And I decided that I should because I had hit my head on the way down. And I am a nurse. And I know the protocol. And so I called a coworker who lived nearby. And she drove me to the hospital where I work. And I was taken to an examination room. And a doctor I knew named Raymond Patel came in. And he checked my vitals. And he asked me what happened, and I told him, and he nodded. And he said you need to eat and you need to sleep. And he said I want to keep you overnight for observation because of the head impact. And I said okay, and he left. And the nurse came in and started enrollment 4. And I lay in the hospital bed in the place where I worked. And I looked at the ceiling. And I thought about how strange it was to be a patient in a room where I had taken care of people. And I thought about my grandmother. And I thought about the coffee shop meeting the next morning, and I closed my eyes, and I must have fallen asleep, because when I opened them again, it was early morning, and the light in the room was that particular hospital early morning light that looks gray and flat and a little unreal. And there was a sound in the hallway, and I heard voices, and I heard my father's voice, and I heard my stepmother's voice, and I lay there and I listened. And I realized that someone from the hospital must have called them because I was listed as having them as emergency contacts, because I had never updated the form, and they were here, and the doctor was talking to them outside my room, and I heard Dr. Patel's voice, and he said she has regained consciousness, and she is stable, and there is no indication of serious injury. And then he said I would like to speak with her first before you go in, and there was a pause, and I heard my stepmother say, we are her family, and Dr. Patel said, yes, ma'am. And I will bring you in shortly. And I lay there, and I thought about the fact that they were here, and I thought about the fact that they had driven to the hospital in the early morning, and I thought about what that meant, and I thought about what it didn't mean, and Dr. Patel came in, and he looked at me, and he said, your family is here, and I said, I know, and he said, are you okay to see them? And I said, yes. And he said, are you sure, because you don't have to? And I said, I am sure, and he nodded, and he left, and the door opened, and my father came in first, and my stepmother came in behind him, and my father looked at me in the hospital bed, and his face did something that I had not seen it do in a very long time. Which was it showed something real, not the arranged expression from the graveside, but something that looked like actual worry. and he said, "Claire, are you okay?" And I said, "I am fine," and my stepmother stood behind him. And she looked at the Roman 4, and she looked at the monitor, and she said, "What happened?" And I said, "I passed out, I haven't been eating or sleeping well." And it caught up with me, and my stepmother said, "You should have called us," and I looked at her. And I thought about the porch and the closed door and the wine, and I thought about the fact that she was standing here in a hospital room telling me I should have called her when 2 days after her own mother-in-law's funeral, she had locked me out of my grandmother's house. And I felt something move through me, but I did not say any of that. And I said, "I am fine," and my father sat down in the chair next to the bed. And he looked at me, and he said, "We are still on for this morning, right?" And I said, "Yes." And he nodded, and my stepmother said, "Maybe we should reschedule," and I said, "No." And I looked at her, and I said I would like to keep the appointment, and she held my gaze for a moment. And then she looked away, and they left, and Dr. Patel came back in. And he said, "Are you sure you want to leave?" And I said, "I am sure." And he said, "You need to eat something," and I said, "I will." And he discharged me, and I changed out of the hospital gown and into the clothes my coworker had brought from my apartment. And I signed the discharge papers, and I walked out of the hospital where I worked as a patient, and not as a nurse, and I got in my car, and I drove to the coffee shop, and I was 11 minutes early, and I ordered a black coffee, and I sat down at a table near the window, and I waited, and I had the copy of the trust document in my bag, and I could feel it there like a weight that was not heavy but was present, and I drank my coffee, and I watched the door. My father came in first, and then my stepmother came in behind him, the way she always did, and he looked like he hadn't been sleeping, and there were dark circles under his eyes, and his shirt was untucked in a way that was not like him. And he sat down across from me, and my stepmother sat down next to him, and she put her purse on the table, and she looked at me, and she said, "How are you feeling?" And I said, "Fine," and I didn't say anything else for a moment. And then I reached into my bag, and I took out the trust document, and I put it on the table in front of them without saying anything about it first, and I watched them look at it, and I watched my stepmother's expression change as she read the header, and my father looked at me. And I said, "Your grandmother set this up in 2009, 14 years ago. Gerald Oates has been holding it since she passed. It covers the house, the property, and the building on Meridian." And my stepmother started to say something, and I let her say it, and it came out. "Pieces, she never mentioned this, and that can't be legal, and you must have known. And are you sure this is real? And you should have told us before coming here." And I let all of it land on the table between us, and I didn't argue with any of it, and I didn't defend myself, and I didn't raise my voice. And I just sat there, and I let her run through all of it. And when she was done, I said, "I am not here to fight with you. I am here because she would have wanted me to tell you this directly, not through an attorney, and not through a certified letter." And my father looked at his hands, and I said, "I have been thinking about what I want to do." And I said, "The building on Meridian, I have already been in contact with a hospice organization that has been looking for a permanent home, and Grandma spent her career in cardiology, and then spent her last 5 years volunteering with hospice patients on weekends. And I think she would have liked that." And I paused. And I said, "The house I am going to keep, she built it. It should stay in the family." And I looked at my father specifically, not at my stepmother. And I said, "You are welcome to come and stay. It is your mother's house. That doesn't change. But I need the codes changed back. And I need to be the one who makes decisions about it going forward." And my stepmother pushed her chair back, and my father stayed seated. And he said, "She didn't tell me." And his voice was quiet and a little rough. And I said, "She didn't tell me either, not the details, but she told me once that everything was arranged." Trusted her, I always trusted her. And he didn't say anything to that, and there wasn't much to say. And my stepmother stood up, and she said, "We will be in touch." And she walked out, and my father sat there for another moment. And he looked at me, and I saw something in his face that I had not seen in a long time, which was a kind of recognition, like he was seeing something that had been in front of him for years, but that he had not let himself look at directly. And he said, "I am sorry, Claire." And I said, "I know." And he stood up, and he followed my stepmother out, and I sat at the table, and I finished my coffee, and I looked out the window, and I thought about my grandmother, and I thought about the fact that she had arranged all of this 14 years ago, and she had done it quietly and precisely and without sentiment, and she had trusted me to handle it the way she would have, and I hoped that I had. The paperwork took about 6 weeks to finalize, and Gerald Oates handled most of it efficiently and without drama. And during those 6 weeks, I did not hear from my stepmother, and I did not hear from my half-brother. And my father called once to ask about the transfer timeline, and I told him, and he said okay, and that was the extent of it. And I went to work, and I came home, and I ate properly, and I slept, and I did the things that my grandmother would have expected me to do, which were the ordinary, unglamorous things that hold a life together when everything else feels uncertain. And the house transferred into my name on a Thursday in late November, just before the first real snow of the year. And I drove out there the afternoon after the transfer was complete, and I sat in the driveway for a while before I went inside, because I wanted to have that moment of sitting in the driveway, and knowing that it was mine, not in a greedy way, but in the way that you know something is yours because someone who loved you chose to give it to you. And I sat there, and I looked at the hydrangeas, which were cut back for winter, just stumps and bare stems along the foundation. And I had done it myself 2 weeks earlier on a Saturday morning, because I knew how she wanted it done, and I didn't trust anyone else to do it right. And I had not realized at the time that I was doing something that would feel like this, like a small act of care that connected me to her across the distance that death makes. And I went inside, and the room smelled like her, still faintly, the particular combination of wood smoke and paper, and the cedar she kept in the closets. And I walked through slowly the kitchen, where she helped me with chemistry, and the living room where she watched the evening news every night without fail, because she believed an informed person had an obligation to pay attention to the world, and the back hallway with the photographs, her in her white coat, young, in front of the hospital, where she had done her residency, and her at the dock with me when I was maybe 7, both of us squinting into the sun, her hand on my shoulder. And I stood in front of that photograph for a while, and I thought about the fact that she had not left me a lesson at the end, tucked into a trust document like a note in a lunch bag. There was no letter, no recorded message, no final words arranged for effect. That was not her style. She had left me what she always left me, which was an example, 30 years of showing up consistently and making precise decisions, and refusing to perform emotions she didn't feel, and refusing to suppress the ones she did. And she had trusted me to understand, because she had spent years making sure I would, and that was the whole of her message, and it required no page to turn. Outside, the lake was gray and flat under a November sky, and the dock was empty, and the cottage behind the garden still had her garden tools in the shed, and I had checked when I came to cut back the hydrangeas, and I had left them exactly where they were, and I sat down at the kitchen table, and I had my laptop and a notepad and a cup of coffee, and I had a meeting the following week with the director of the hospice organization about the Meridian building, and I had a long list of things to sort through, and decisions to make, and phone calls to return, and I had, for the first time in 11 days of being turned away and locked out and treated like a guest who had overstayed, a specific and grounded feeling that I recognized from years of working at my grandmother's kitchen table, which was the feeling of having the right work in front of me. And I opened the laptop, and I started working, and the house was quiet, and the lake was gray, and I was home. My father called 2 weeks later, not my stepmother, my father, and he called on a Sunday evening, and I picked up, and we talked for almost an hour, which was longer than we had talked in years. And he asked about the house, and he asked how the hospice meeting had gone, and he did not apologize exactly, but he said some things that circled close to it, and I listened to all of them without interrupting. And near the end of the call, he said, "She never told me what she was doing," and I said, "I know," and he said, "I don't know if she was protecting you or testing me," and I said, "I think she was being honest about what she saw." And he was quiet for a moment on the other end, the long quiet of someone sitting with something they already knew. And he said, "Yeah, that sounds like her." And it did, it sounded exactly like her, the precision, and the long view, and the absolute refusal to insult people by pretending not to notice who they were. And she had looked at her family, clearly all of us, and she had arranged things accordingly, and she had trusted that the people she had invested in would know what to do when it mattered. And I had been locked out on a porch in a black dress with cold coming up through the boards, and I had been reduced to ringing a doorbell at the house I grew up in, and none of that had been small or painless or easy to absorb. And I was not pretending it had been, but I had sat in my car, and I had thought about what she would recognize in me, and I had chosen the thing she had spent years teaching me to choose, and that was the whole of it. That was the inheritance, the real one, the kind that doesn't require a document and can't be locked behind a changed code. The building on Meridian became the hospice center's permanent home, and the following spring they named the main consultation room after my grandmother, a small brass plaque beside the door with her name and her years of service. And I drove by it on my way to work most mornings, and I didn't always stop. But I always noticed it, which I think was what she would have wanted, because she had told me once standing at the dock in the last summer before she got sick that the only kind of legacy worth building was one you couldn't see from the outside, and reputations were visible, she said, and bank accounts were visible, and what you actually left behind was in the people you had shaped the habits and the standards, and the voice in someone's head at 3 a.m, when a decision needed to be made, and no one was watching. And I think about that a lot now in the kitchen at the house on the lake at the same table where she helped me understand things I didn't know I would need, and I think about it when I make a decision I am not sure about, and I hear her particular brand of quiet certainty somewhere in the back of my thinking, pointing me toward the harder right thing instead of the easier wrong one. And she didn't just leave me a house, she left me the part of herself that knew how to live in it, and how to live in the world, and how to be the kind of person who does the right thing when no one important is watching. And that is the trust that can't be broken, and the code that can't be changed, and the door that will always be open. If this story gave you chills, smash that like button and tell us in the comments, what is the most satisfying revenge you have ever witnessed? And of course, subscribe for more stories like this, because there are thousands of them out there waiting to be told, and some of them are quiet, and some of them are loud, and some of them are 31 pages long and 14 years in the making, and the best ones always are.